happy to invite here Professor Lars Elleström from Linnaeus University from Sweden, in Kalmar and Växjö. I should say that today's lecture launches this year's series of what we in English could call Literary Critical Forum, and whose topic is literature, new media, and mediality. The next session will be in November, but that's something that we can talk about later, and that you can find on the internet as well. So Lars Elleström is one of the leading representatives internationally of the theory of intermediality. He was invited by Masaryk University to Brno to give a series of lectures for doctoral students. And we took the opportunity also to invite him to the Institute of Czech Literature as well. In doing this, our motives were not wholly unselfish. We have our own motives or follow our own interests, let's say, but we will get to this. Lars Elleström is professor of comparative literature in Linnaeus University. He chairs the International Society for Intermediate Studies. Among his publications, one could name Divine Madness on Interpreting Literature, Music and the Visual Arts, ironically, from 2002. Media Borders, a book from 2010, and his most recent publication, I think it is the most recent book, Media Transformation, the Transfer of Media Characteristics among Media, published in 2014 by Palgrave Macmillan, where he presents a complex model of media transformation through the processes of first transmediation and secondly media representation. So these are the sort of two main concepts. And he also uses there the examples of Jan Schwankmajer's short films, so that also makes it obviously interesting for us. I should say that the structure of today's event is we will have the lecture first, then you will be invited, and actually already through the lecture you will be invited to ask questions, but after the lecture there will be a discussion with you, the audience, and after that, if not everyone, if you're still not tired and exhausted, then there should be a kind of discussion among our round table group, including Tomáš Kudý, Josef Šebek, and myself, who are, as you probably know, working on a medial project in the institute here. I should say that what we find in Lars Elleström's work inspiring was the model of media relations, where Professor Elleström distinguishes different modalities of media, so maybe that's something that we will talk about after the lecture in the discussion. And we consider this model among the most successful recent attempts to integrate the perspectives of literary and art studies with those of media theory, media studies, and new media as well. The lecture might be related to a new angle of research. We'll see about this. The title is Coherence and Truthfulness in Communication, Mediality, Multimodality, Indexicality and Fictionality. So it's research for. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for this. I'm very glad to be here. Thanks for inviting me. And if you want to move forward, please don't be shy. And if you insist on sitting very far away, remind me to raise my voice now and then so that you can hear me. As Rickard mentioned, I still work very much within the framework that I have been dealing with for 7, 8 or 9 years, something like this, It will not be that apparent in the talk today, but trust me, everything is related here. So what I actually focus on today is indexicality, which I already 7 years ago described as one of the modes of the semiotic modality, following purpose. So I want to apologize for two things. The first thing is that I will mainly read my paper today. And the second thing is that it's rather dense and complex. And sometimes I'm not sure that I understand everything myself. So that is one of the reasons why I want to stay quite close to my manuscript, because if I start to improvise too much, I will lose my way and I will miss the things that I ought to say, and then everything will be absolutely incomprehensible. So please bear with my reading here. Afterwards we will have a discussion, but please also, it will take for around 1 hour, and it will not be speed reading. It will be a moderate pace. So around 1 hour, if you feel an urge to have things clarified on the way, please do interrupt me, and perhaps you can help me with noticing desperate faces and waving hands and so forth, because I don't want us all to get completely lost before we reach the end. Hopefully, in the end, at least some things will be understood. So, okay. Great. That is the first PowerPoint. Because you wanted me to have a very long subtitle. Yes, because my original subtitle was even less comprehensible, actually. So, no, I have to do it. Okay. So, how can truthfulness in all kinds of human communication be conceptualized so that it may be methodically investigated? This is a fundamental epistemological research question of this paper. Existing research in the area primarily examines how certain verbal propositions do or do not correspond to already known actual circumstances. These philosophical treatises are mainly based on the logical aspects of language that are determined by a particular use of symbols understood as habitual signs. Although interesting in themselves, certainly, such investigations say nothing about how truthfulness is actually established by communication. This is very important. How truthfulness is established, not how it is referred to. So, how truthfulness is actually established by communication. I think that this requires a focus on another kind of science, indices or indexes, which connect to objects not on the basis of habits or conventions, but on contiguity or real connection. And this is a key notion here today. So, real connections. Indices being based on real connections. It furthermore requires attention to all kinds of communicative media, not only those involving language. Media products, according to my definition, are those intermediate bodily or non-bodily material entities with semiotic capacities that make transfer of cognitive import among human minds possible through representation. Media products thus act as collections of material signs that make it possible to share mental object. This is my frame of communication. The media product, the intermediate entity between minds that communicate. So as soon as I talk about mediation, mediality, it's about communication. The aim of this paper is to construct a model that shows in which ways human communication may actually put us in contact with what we perceive to be the surrounding world through indices. A conceptual framework to be used for analyzing truthfulness in actual, complex, and often multimodal communication. It should be valid for all media types, news reports, photographs, testimonies, novels, songs, caresses, scientific diagrams, etc. What's this, number 3? No. So, my approach will be semiotic, using some of Charles Sanders Peirce's foundational conceptions and his notions of the index as starting points, but not his own philosophical ideas about reality and truth. My next move will therefore be to take a closer look at Peirce's notion of index. I will then present my central distinction between intercommunicational and extra-communicational domains. No, what is happening here? Okay, yes, yeah, sure. Yeah. So, I did 2 minutes. Really bad stuff. You had a show going on here behind me. I didn't realize anything. So I'll simply be sure to come back. So this is 1. This is 2. This is 3. Peirce's notion of index, right? Good. So I will then present my central distinction between intracommunicational and extracommunicational domains. After that, I will suggest a foundational catalogue of different kinds of continuity. It will then be time for charting varieties of internal coherence and external truthfulness. In addition, the central notion of communicating minds will be scrutinized in the light of the developed conceptual framework. And finally, I will briefly criticize the notions of fictionality in fiction in favor of what I think is a more nuanced conception of extra-communicational indexicality or external truthfulness. Right. So, in order to be able to develop the model, a few basic semiotic notions derived from Peirce must thus be clarified. Yeah, okay. He basically distinguished between 3 sign constituents. A representamen stands for an object in some respects, and thus, quoting Peirce, creates in the mind of that person an interpretant. Peirce very much emphasizes that signs are not static items, but dynamical functions constituted by entirely relational constituents, existing only in interaction with each other and driven by mental activity. So these entities are not out there in the world as such, but when one perceives something as a sign of representamen, as standing for something else, calling something else forth in the mind, then the object is created in the mind, resulting in some sort of understanding and interpretation. No? Good. Peirce furthermore differs between 3 sign types, characterized by their respective grounds, that is, the relation between representamen and object. How come that there are relations between representamen and objects? What is the ground of this connection, that something makes something else present to the mind? And Peirce's answer is that there are 3 basic variations of grounds that make representation possible, so to speak. He then talks about, as many of you already know, There are icons based on similarity, indices on continuity or real connections, and there are symbols based on habits, sometimes described as conventions. So these are the three basic ways of making signification possible. No? I have to keep it there. Okay. The index is then the semiotic backbone of this investigation. As a rule, Peirce emphasizes a physical cause and effect relation between representation and object. He thus argues that photographs are not only icons but also indices, since they are, as he says, produced under such circumstances that they are physically forced to correspond point by point to nature. Likewise, symptoms of disease are signs which become such by virtue of being really connected with their objects. Although Peirce repeatedly emphasizes that the ground of an index consists of a real connection, it's clear that the notion of indexicality goes beyond the real, understood solely in physical terms. He also highlights non-physical connections and clearly states that indices do not, and I quote, have exclusive reference to objects of experience, and that, again quote, it makes no difference whether the connection between representation and object is natural or artificial or merely mental. So a real connection may go on in the material world, but also in the mental world, in the world of human minds, for instance. And I'll explain a little bit more about that later. Oh. There was some wonderful sudden a whole lot of things happening. Okay, that was the last one, I think. So, gently. No? Okay. If I push too hard, it simply runs away. All right, so now to intercommunicational and extracommunicational domains and objects. Representations that initiate semiosis in communication come from sensory perception of media products. One perceives configurations of sound, visions, touch, and so forth that are created or brought out by someone and understood to signify something. But from where do the objects come? They clearly do not emerge out of nothing, but are drawn from earlier percepts, sensations, and notions that are stored in memory, either in long-term memory or in short-term memory, which may also cover ongoing communication. So when I say that objects are stored in the memory, that experiences and so forth that we have already been acquainted with, earlier may be only a fraction of a second ago, or it may be decades ago. But in any case, the objects that are called forth by representations or signs somehow exist in the mind already. So the stored mental entities may be direct percepts from outside of communication. They may be interpretants from semiosis outside of communication. They may be interpretants from semiosis in earlier communication, or they may be interpretations from semiosis in ongoing communication. This is to say that objects of semiosis always require what Peirce calls collateral experience. In other words, collateral experience may both be formed by semiosis inside the spatial-temporal frame of the communicative act and stem from other, earlier involvements with the world, including formal communication as well as direct experience of the surrounding existence. So in line with this twofold origin of collateral experience that renders semiotic objects possible, I distinguish between two utterly entwined but nevertheless dissimilar areas in the mind of the perceiver of media products: the intra-communicational and the extra-communicational domains, emphasizing then a difference between the forming of cognitive import in ongoing communication and what precedes and surrounds the ongoing communication. Consequently, there are both intra-communicational and extra-communicational indexical objects. As indices are grounded on real connections, they are equally important for the two domains. On the one hand, they link entities in the intra-communicational domain to each other and thus establish coherence to some extent. Intra-communicational indices are the glue of semiosis, preventing separate interpretants created in communication from falling apart in incomprehensible fragments. So the real connections make the sphere of communication to something that can be comprehended as a whole, so to speak. On the other hand, the indices link entities in this intra-communicational domain to entities in the extra-communicational domain, and thus establish truthfulness of various sorts and degrees. Extra-communicational indices are the anchor of semiosis, preventing the interpretants of communication from drifting away from the extra-communicational domain. So the extra-communicational indices make what we communicate to make it somehow stay in touch with what we perceive to be the real world. Now let us see. No. You saw my finger. You will have to be extra time. Yeah, good. Very good. Brilliant idea. So it's wireless? Yes. This would be better. Yes, that's the domain scenarios. Good. So, thank you. I shouldn't do that before I know that this one actually works too. But I'll try. Yeah, good. So, the extra communicational domain should thus be understood as the background area in the mind of the perceiver of media products. It is constituted by everything that one is already familiar with. As it is a mental domain, it cannot be said to consist of the world as such. It's rather constituted by the world as one knows it, through perception and through semiosis. The extra-communicational domain includes experiences of both what one perceives to be more objective states of affair, such as dogs, universities, music, statistical relations, and so forth, and what one presumes to be more subjective states of affairs, states of mind related to individual experiences. It's thus actually formed in one's mind not only through semiosis and immediate external perception, but also through interoception, proprioception, and mental introspection. This is important to me, not to think about the world as something that is only out there. The existing world is also something that exists in us, so to speak. What I think is also real. So it's important to note that vital parts of the extra communication domain are constituted by perceptions and interpretations of media products. In other words, formal communication is thus very much part of what precedes and surrounds ongoing communication. Yep, very good. In contrast to the extra communicational domain, the intra-communicational domain is the foreground area in the mind of the perceiver of media products. It is formed by one's perception and interpretation of the media products that are present in the ongoing act of communication, like you now listening to my voice, seeing my gestures and so forth. That is the foreground area of my communication going on right now. It is based on both extra-communicational objects emanating from the extra-communicational domain and intra-communicational objects arising in the intra-communicational domain. As the intra-communicational domain is formed by communicative semiosis, it may be called a virtual sphere. The virtual should not be understood in opposition to the actual, but as something having potential. I hence define a virtual sphere created by communicative semiosis as something that has the potential to have real connections to the extra communication. It may be related to what is out there, outside our communicating minds. A virtual sphere, as I define it, can consist of anything from a very brief thought triggered by a few spoken words, or a quick glance at an advertisement or anything else, to a complex narrative or a scientific theory formed by hours of watching television or reading books. It's that sphere created in the mind when one communicates through media products. The coexistence of intra-communicational and extra-communicational objects result in a possible double view on virtual spheres. From one point of view, they form self-ruled spheres with a certain degree of experienced autonomy. From another point of view, they are always exceedingly dependent on the extra-communicational domain. Now, this is important, so I emphasize that the crucial point to be made here is that intra-communicational objects cannot be created ex nihilo. They are completely derived from extra-communicational objects. This is because nothing can actually be grasped in communication without the resource of extra-communicational objects. So what one thinks and understands in communication doesn't come from nowhere. It comes from the objects already stored in mind, what we already know, what we have already thought or experienced and so forth. So those stored mental entities, so to speak, are what actually is put forth and being activated in communication. And without these earlier experiences, these remembered ideas, notions, and so forth, nothing would happen in communication. So I then argue that even the most fanciful narratives require recognizable objects, objects that emerge from collateral experience in the extra-communicational domain in order to make sense. To be more precise, intra-communicational objects are always in some way parts, combinations or blends of extra-communicational objects. And please remember, every time I say the term object here, it's in persons, so it's not only these things, but ideas in the mind that may be of a mental or material character. So it's possible to represent, say, griffins, because one's acquaintance with extra-communicational material objects such as lions and eagles that can easily be combined. A virtual sphere may even include notions such as a round square, consisting of two mutually exclusive extra-communicational objects, together forming a very odd intra-communicational object. Also, more purely mental extra-communicational objects may be modified or united into new material, into new mental intra-communicational objects. Objects such as familiar emotions may be combined into novel intra-communicational objects consisting of, say, conflicts between or blends of emotions that are perceived as unique, although one has already acquaintance with the components. So the newness is created in the combination, the blend, and so forth, but the stuff it is made on are those things that we are already acquainted with somehow. So the question then arises, if all intercommunicational objects are ultimately derived from extra-communicational objects, how come that virtual spheres are often experienced as having a certain degree of autonomy? This is because they, in part or in whole, may be perceived as new gestalts that disrupt the connection to the extra-communicational domain. This happens when one does not immediately recognize the new composites of extra-communicational objects. And the reason for them not being recognized, is that they have not earlier been cognized in the particular constellation in which they appear in the virtual sphere. So even though it may feel like the virtual sphere created by communication is entirely new, I will argue, no, it's not entirely new, it's based on old building blocks, so to speak. And the newness consists in the combinations, the blends, and so forth. So this leads us then to a visual diagram of the basic ideas here. This is what we have in our mind before communication starts. We have memories of perceptions, acquaintances with the world, and so forth. Things that we have experienced more or less directly, so to speak. On the other hand, we also have memories of other virtual spheres, that is, memories stored in our mind of earlier communication. Things we have read, movies we have seen, etc., etc. So everything that we have learned, so to speak, through communication. Contact with the world, what we perceive to be the world. Again, note that the world as one knows it, the world as it is somewhere the unknown. So I'm only talking about what we believe to be the true reality around us. When that communication starts, a virtual sphere is created in the mind, and that virtual sphere is then consisted of extra-communicational, immediate and presented mental and material objects from the perceived actual sphere, and also then earlier communication, and also the specific variations of ideas and thoughts that are created in this very moment of communication, so to speak. So in a sense, something new is is created here. We perceive it as a gestalt. It's a virtual sphere with a certain degree of coherence, but it basically consists of material from what we pick up from the background area of our mind. I hope you liked it. You have it on the handout, so if it's not immediately clear, and if you bother to think about it, you may have some time to take a look at it. Again, and of course, this is a variation of ideas that have been presented by hundreds of philosophers that are much more bright than me, but nevertheless, it's my specific take on this problem that I present in order to be able to say a few things about this specific notion then of indices, truthfulness. So now, after this overview of the various spheres in the mind, well, we are in a position to further scrutinize the notion of indexicality with greater emphasis on its core principles of contiguity and how it operates in relation to the intercommunicational and the extra-communication. So what are real connections on closer inspection? Surprisingly little has been written about this, and even in prose you only find certain hints. So for me this has been an empty space in research, so to speak. Contiguity based on real connections, sure, but how does one understand the notion of a real connection? I think it's generally assumed that real connections consist of contiguity in space and or time. As these contiguities must be understood in terms of both materiality and mind work, real connections can be established through concrete sensory perception of physical space and its temporal transformation, as well as through more abstract sensations of conceptual space and time. Given this sliding material mental scale, it's clear that real connections may be established also between entities that differ materially and mentally. So I suggest categorization of, on the one hand, general subclasses that can be discerned as different kinds of relation between entities, and on the other hand, specific subclasses that can be discerned as different kinds of relational channels between entities. Perhaps that will be possible to understand if I simply continue. So we'll start then with different kinds of contiguity in terms of general subclasses of contiguity. Yes, it works. So under the heading of general subclasses, we have contiguity in a weaker sense, co-presence. Co-presence simply includes proximity, either in the sense of being adjacent, like a person standing close to a door, or in the sense of being part of, doorknob belonging to a door, or human body including hand. We also have contiguity in a stronger sense, interaction. Interaction includes proximity and additionally causality, understood either as unidirectional, like person opening door, it's an interaction going in one direction, or reciprocal, like person opening door that swings back and hits her in the head. That's interactivity going in two directions. You can go on like this, but the point here is then that these are very general, abstract subclasses. Co-presence, interaction, including just about any kinds of specificities. Contiguity as co-presence and especially adjacency tends toward being more indirect, ambiguous and subjective compared to contiguity as interaction. As everything can have some kind of spatiotemporal co-presence with almost anything, there's little point in classifying these weaker sorts of real connections. The specific subclasses that will be listed in a moment are therefore primarily applicable on contiguity understood as interaction. Hello. Interaction. Okay. These sorts of real connections tend to be relatively direct, unambiguous and intersubjective, although they are by no means independent of the human perspective on the events of the world. So now to specific subclasses of contiguity. And the following list of various kinds of relational channels between entities is in no way complete, and there are no clear borders between these categories. The classification is merely intended to give a broad overview of the phenomenon of real connections by way of illuminating examples ranging from material to mental contiguity. So first, some examples of contiguity that does not include mental activities in the relational channel between entities. And that embraces mechanical contiguity, like between finger and fingerprint, between bow being drawn across strings and sounding by the sound of violin. Electromagnetic contiguity is another possibility between, let's say, photons emitted from matter and digital photographs, between input in computers and what is seen on the computer screens. Chemical contiguity between photons emitted from matter and more classical photographs, between added heat and boiling water. And another possibility is what might be called organic contiguity, like between disease and observable symptoms, between dead animal and fossil. Contiguity that includes corporeal and conscious or unconscious mental activities in the relational channel between entities holds, for instance, the combination of mental and mechanical contiguity, like between decision to use a pencil and written text. So it starts as something mental and ends up as something material. The contiguity goes first through the mind and then out in the material world. Or between sudden rage and the smashing of a window. And the combination of mental and organic contiguity, like, say, between emotional state and voice quality, facial expression and body posture. Another possibility would be contiguity between the refusal to eat and the sensation of hunger. Finally, there's contiguity that consists of conscious or unconscious mental activities in the relational channel between entities, like between sensations and assumptions, between premises and conclusions. Those are also real connections, but on an entirely mental basis. And so on and so forth. So all these general and specific subclasses of contiguity are relevant for understanding how both extra-communicational and intra-communicational objects become part of virtual spheres. It should be remembered, though, that even indices that build on real connections of the stronger kind into action and that reach out to the perceived actual sphere represents only the world as one knows it, not the world as such. We know nothing about the world as, or we know rather little we don't know what we know about the world as such. So it's about the world as we know it. Not only mental, but also mechanical, electromagnetic, chemical, and organic contiguity are actual presumed contiguities formed by collateral experience. So if we perceive certain symptoms of an illness, we are not 100% sure that it is a symptom of that illness. It's something that we presume based on previous experiences and knowledge and so on. And we can be quite sure or less sure. And usually history tends to prove people wrong. So we should be careful about being sure about perceiving real connections, but it's something. Now, what do all these types of indices do in communication? My answer is that they generate internal coherence and external truthfulness. So, intracommunicational indexicality. You remember indices working within the virtual sphere created in the act of communication? Intracommunicational indexicality is semiosis creating bonds within a virtual sphere, connecting representations on the ground of contiguity to objects that are drawn into or formed inside the virtual sphere as it evolves. The constituents of a virtual sphere are initially, when first being discerned, most certainly adjacent, and as perception and interpretation evolve, they are often understood to be part of each other and to interact. As the mind strives for perceiving gestalts, one is deeply inclined to use these real connections as grounds for indices, which leads to chains and webs of representation that create coherence. If communication goes forward and makes sense, its constituents are contiguous also in a stronger sense, and indexicality based on causality rather than simply adjacency may result, which leads to an even stronger sense of coherence. Objects are not simply situated close to each other, they actually cause each other and are reactions on each other and so on. Internal coherence in communication may hence be defined as real connections between intracommunicational representations and objects. Examples of internal coherence are represented persons and actions appear to be generally interrelated. Events and moods seem to somehow follow from each other rather than occur randomly. Details are apprehended as parts of discernible mental or material wholes. Psychological states, ideas and concepts are developed intelligibly. Physical properties are associated to material items in a consistent way. Physical and psychological actions lead to reactions that are linked to the actions, etc. Indexical junctions like these, based on various sorts of continuity, occur in all kinds of media products, whether they consist of a limited amount of material, spatiotemporal, sensorial, and semiotic modes, such as still images or written text, or are markedly multimodal, such as movies that are both spatial and temporal, both visual and auditory, and both decidedly iconic and symbolic. So, and this I want to emphasize as well, an important role of intracommunication indexicality is hence to knit together the different modes of a media product through cross-modal representation, so that an integrated virtual sphere, rather than a set of unrelated, mode-specific material spheres, can be created. It would be rather strange and pointless if you thought that my gestures formed one act of communication and my speech another act of communication, so that you created 2, 3, or 4 virtual spheres. No, the mind strives towards connecting these different modes into something that is intelligible, possible, and relates. So it's cross-modal indexicality. In contrast, extra-communicational indexicality is a semiosis creating bonds between a virtual sphere and its surroundings, connecting representativeness on the ground of contiguity to object from outside the virtual sphere, from outside what is formed within in the specific moment of communication. I suggest this is equivalent to what I call then external truthfulness. This is what I postulate. This is how I use the terms. So, external truthfulness in communication may hence be defined as real connections between intra-communicational representativeness and extra-communicational objects. The notion of truthfulness that I propose is thus to be understood as a conceived communicative truth, not to be confused with truth. Truth understood as a feature of the actual, never fully accessible world. So truthfulness is it's a trait in communication. However, truth may possibly be approached through accumulated truthful communication from different sources and the observations of effects from further action on the basis of conceived truthfulness. Truthfulness may thus be tested, so to speak. One may go from communication and then interact with the world and see if things work. One tries to understand the map. It communicates something. A mental sphere is created, a virtual sphere is created. Okay, I think the city of Prague looks like this. This is my virtual sphere. Then I may go out. And if I don't find my way, of course I may be mistaken, but may also be the case that the map is corrupted. In that way, one may test communicative ideas and see if it connects to the real world in action. Now, to what can communication be truthful, more precisely? To what can communication be truthful? I suggest that extra-communicational indexical objects can be classified in various ways, and each category corresponds to a certain kind of truthfulness. I will now give some examples of such forms of objects and truthfulness. It's not a very rigid classification, but rather an incomplete inventory of contrasting types that sometimes overlap, sometimes complement each other, and sometimes rather are in conflict. And soon you will hear a name that literary scholars are familiar with. Isn't that nice? Okay. So, following the division of the extra-communicational domains into 2 parts, we may state that the virtual sphere can be true to objects in the perceived actual sphere, or to objects in other virtual spheres, to our notions of the surrounding world, or to our acquaintance with earlier communications. So we may communicate something that is wrong, that doesn't fit with the world, so to speak, and then we may communicate about that communication. And that communication may be truthful, although what it refers to was not truthful from the beginning. So it was true that you said that, but what you said was not true. It is also the case that the virtual sphere can be true to objects that are material or to objects that are mental. And this is a very crucial and in a way self-evident, but often neglected observation. Now, connecting to an age-old distinction of Aristotle, we can furthermore say that a virtual sphere can be true to objects that are more or less universal, or to objects that are particular. Some variations of this distinction would be to say that a virtual sphere can be truthful to objects that are typical or atypical, permanent or temporary, global or local. This could perhaps be understood as a sort of statistical view on truthfulness, having to do with probability of repeated contiguity in various environments and circumstances. In a related manner, a virtual sphere can be true to objects that are wholes or to objects that are details. Truthfulness in details does not guarantee a true whole, and a true whole does not guarantee, and the true whole may harbor untruthful details. This is truthfulness understood as perception of gestalts or particulars. A more complex way of sorting extra-communicational indexical science is to say that the virtual sphere can be true to objects that have been manifested in the past, that are presently manifested, that are bound to be manifested in the future, or that may be manifested in the future. The latter forms of truthfulness certainly rely heavily on mental contiguity. Now, in this context, it must also be noted that any material item can be drawn into the communicative act and become a media product, interacting with other media products or creating highly multimodal joint media products. In trials, for instance, fingerprints and other pieces of evidence are framed in such a way that they communicate together with standard media types such as speech, written text, still images, movies, sound recordings, and so forth, that incorporate them in order to create a virtual sphere based on strong contiguity to the perceived actual sphere. Thus, all varieties of contiguity, all kinds of intracommunicational indexical junctions, all types of extracommunicational indexical objects are relevant for external truthfulness in communication. And this abundance of relevant factors demonstrates the complexity of forming coherent virtual spheres with real connections to the extracommunicational domain. There is, however, one factor that I think deserves special attention. And that is communicating minds, warranting internal coherence and external truthfulness. So communication, as defined here, is about transferring cognitive import among human minds. Therefore, the notion of communicating mind, and for the moment understood as the mind of the producer of cognitive import, not the perceiver, is of distinct relevance. In related but clearly different ways, it's central for conceiving both the intracommunicational and the extracommunicational domains. To a certain extent, communicating minds are responsible for both internal coherence and external truthfulness as objects in the virtual sphere itself. In other virtual spheres, I'll take the last sentence one more time. Okay. So, I got the intonation all wrong. So, to a certain extent, communicating minds are responsible for both internal coherence and external truthfulness as objects in the virtual sphere itself, in other virtual spheres, and in the perceived actual sphere. And to explain that, a perceived, actual, communicating mind. So the starting point for this inquiry is the very plain observation that communicating minds producing some cognitive import to be perceived by a media product, do not necessarily simply disappear behind the virtual spheres created in the perceiver's minds. In many kinds of communicative situations, the communicating mind is decidedly represented by the media product and may hence become part of the virtual sphere. So, in an ordinary conversation, for instance, the word I is often understood as an index for the communicating mind in the perceived actual sphere, using her body and its extension as media products when uttering the word. So when I say I, it refers to the mind in my body that tries to communicate. In other communicative situations, the communicating mind may be much more distant in both time and space, and sometimes, such as when one looks at ancient rock paintings, the producer's mind is not at all accessible and can only be construed as an idea of something that must have existed at some point. We have no idea about who created the rock painting, but we understand that someone must have done it. The communicating mind has existed. And then the painting becomes an index based on weak contiguity, consisting of the notion that someone must have produced the visual configurations through actions of mind and hand. Perceived actual communicating minds are objects that in various degrees warrant external truthfulness. Their existence in and collateral experience of certain parts of the perceived actual sphere make it plausible that certain aspects of the communicative cognitive import are more or less truthful. Of course, the representation of communicating minds in the perceived actual sphere is not in itself a guarantee for complete truthfulness, not at all. But collateral experience of communicating minds makes it possible to partly decide upon the amount of contiguity that is present. Perceived communicating minds are always, as a minimum, necessary links to the perceived actual world. Now the example of virtual communicating mind. Yeah. Soon finished. Apart from representing communicating minds in the perceived actual sphere, media products may also represent communicating minds that emerge within this virtual sphere. As all intercommunicational objects, virtual communicating minds are ultimately constructed by extra-communicational objects, which means that they may well be more or less similar to perceived actual communicating minds. Nevertheless, also perceivers of media products who have no knowledge of, access to, or interest in the actual producers tend to construe virtual spheres that include virtual communicating minds so that they are comprehensible as communicative entities. Like the example of literary text written by anonymous authors. We have no idea about the communicating mind, but nevertheless we create on the basis of what we read the notion of the mind that has produced this piece of communication. So the crave for a certain level of internal coherence can hence be achieved with the aid of virtual communicating minds. Odd details, vague connections, and apparent inconsistencies may be knit together through the representation of virtual communicating minds, having certain ideas, purposes, and peculiarities, and ultimately some sort of responsibility for the virtual sphere making sense. Those of you who are familiar with Booth's notion of inclined author will recognize his idea of the reader constructing the notion of some persona communicating, not the real author, but something that is created within the virtual sphere in the novel or whatever. Okay, so I will finally put external truthfulness in relation to the contrasting notions of fiction and fictionality. Fictionality is normally understood as a supposed, at least partial, quality of certain media types labeled fictions, and pertaining to representation of invented, unreal, or purely imaginary objects. In other words, fictionality is not representation of objects from the perceived actual sphere, but solely from objects from the virtual sphere or other virtual spheres that do not represent the perceived actual sphere. Now, this notion runs into trouble when considering that all communicational objects, so I say at least, that all communicational objects ultimately rely on extra communicational objects, although they emerge within the intracommunicational domain and may gain a sort of autonomy by way of being perceived as new gestalts. A minimal conclusion of this observation is, I think, that fictionality is very difficult to circumscribe because of the floating borders between extra-communicational objects and new intra-communicational gestalts constituted by extra-communicational objects. A more drastic conclusion is that there is no specific quality of fictionality. Only sorts and degrees of truthfulness. And this is the idea that I try to launch. So fictionality, if the term is to be kept at all, should thus not be understood to refer to a distinct feature, but rather to a lack of certain sorts of truthfulness. And in effect, I think, this renders the notion of fictionality superfluous. And oppositions such as truthfulness, fictionality, meaningless. I have written misleading, but I said meaningless, so you can choose what you want, meaningless or misleading. So I hence argue that truthfulness and so-called fictionality are not two different, contrary qualities. They rather represent different grades on the same scale, perhaps one might say. Now, if fictionality is deserted, what is left of fiction, which is supposedly based on fictionality? Non-fiction, if the notion is to be kept at all, must be understood as a range of media types that are expected to have certain kinds of truthfulness. Fiction would then be a range of media types that are expected to lack certain kinds of truthfulness. However, this does not eliminate the condition that there are other kinds of truthfulness in both fiction, including media types such as novels, animated cartoons, ballads, and so on, and non-fiction, such as documentary films, scientific articles, and oral testimonies. I thus finally argue that it gives a better understanding of the varieties of truthfulness in communication if each media type is investigated on a more fine-grained scale regarding expected truthfulness in terms of different kinds of contiguity and different kinds of extra-communicational indexical objects. Qualified media types are defined by, among other things, the very kinds of truthfulness in the media products that constitute them. Media type attributions such as this is a dinner conversation, but this is a legal testimony, can thus be understood as truth claims. In the end, however, qualified media types are not stable entities, but important pragmatic categories that vary through history and cultures. And mapping such manifold diversities is necessary for transcending the coarse categories of fiction and non-fiction. Thank you for bearing with me. This is it. And I don't think I disappointed you when I said that this will be rather complex.
What's the time for questions? Our camera is being moved. So you have time for reconsider. Over there.
What I was asking, just a bit of a clarification. With the basic model, having this this picture in mind, if you talk about communication, it's between at least two minds.
Yeah, exactly.
And the abstract communicational world as we know it, or as who knows it, is it the one that communicates, or the one that receives, or both, or does it have to match? So my question is, when you talk about this match between the intra and extra communicational domain, who's the main? Is it the one that is talking?
The one that perceives. Yes, exactly.
Okay, so it's basically reception.
Yeah, exactly. So that's a good point to emphasize here. So when one thinks about communication and the way I define communication, I mean, and that is not in contradiction to other definitions, is simply my way of framing it. It's about human communication, so human minds, at least two human minds, all right? The media product is the intermediate entity that makes the possibility. So the virtual sphere, yes, it's in the mind of the perceiver. But of course, I don't do it, but of course one could or should say that the producer, the speaker, the writer, or the drawer, or the person who makes gestures and so forth, of course, I shouldn't say of course, so often has some sort of idea about what she wants to communicate. I think sometimes we communicate unconsciously, of course, but somewhere in the mind there is something that wants to come out, so to speak. So I for one, had a certain rather complex virtual sphere in my mind before coming here and reading this to you. But in the end, this model is the perceiver who creates meaning, so to speak, on the basis of what he or she has stored in her mind already. That is what I have been talking about. But we have the mirror image for sure in the producer as well. But if I were to include that too here, I think I would definitely lose my audience. So yeah. That's correct. Oh, that's it. So, thank you. Yes?
Thank you for the impressive and detailed lecture. I have to say, to my mind, I'm slightly backward looking, and it's been slightly scholastic, I have to confess.
Sure.
But as far as I understood, you mentioned that there is not that, if I can make quote, even the entirely new sphere is built from existing signs, so there is nothing new as such, I mean, strictly speaking.
In a way.
In a way, yes. So everything is built from the already existing blocks.
In a way.
Yes. So what would be your notion newness, for instance, of invention in scientific terms. If you invent a new drug, a new medicine, what would be your...
Great questions. Thanks for that. So I had, I think, two related answers, and the first is that if we go back to the basic trichotomy of prose. So as you have noticed, I have emphasized here the representation and the object, so the two more straightforward constituents of the science, so to speak. The entity that triggers something and the entity that is being triggered. Right? So I have emphasized on those and emphasized that the entity being triggered, the object, is always there in the mind stored somewhere. But that is only 2/3 of the story. So I don't make this very clear in the paper because again it would make it even more hard to grasp and so forth. But it should always be understood as being in the background actually here. So we have the third constituent of the sign to be interpreted. So the thing is that even though the internal sphere is created on the ground of already known objects, experiences, and so forth, every act of interpretation, also in communication, also involves then the interpreter. So something happens. So that is one very semiotic way of saying that, yes, what is being created in communication, in the mind of the perceiver, from our point of view, is entirely based on what we have stored in our memories, because it must come from somewhere, so to speak. But the core of semiosis, nevertheless, this is the very important point of Peirce's trichotomy, I think, is that all signification also includes an interpreter. And that means that then, yes, in that way, something new happens in all semiosis. It may possibly happen. Sometimes semiosis is rather straightforward and we don't evolve so but sometimes the interpreter is really vital, meaning that something new is being created. So that is my first answer. And it's not in contradiction to the idea that it's difficult. Who invented these terms? I think I did. So even though intracommunicational objects are always based on extracommunicational objects, it doesn't mean that this is the end of the story, because there are not only representations and objects, we also have interpreters. And the other answer is that, and that I made somehow more explicit here, is that when we draw from our memories or knowledge or our collateral experience, these entities, these objects are being combined, blended and merged in different ways. So we perceive a new gestalt, right? Even though we are familiar with the entities, something, to a certain extent, something new is being created, because we have never earlier perhaps experienced exactly this kind of combination of objects. So you may say, after my speech here, that I recognize everything, nothing new. But even though if nothing were new, it still is a little bit new, perhaps not better, but it's new in the sense that it's a new combination and blends of various known entities. So in that way there are, for sure, possibilities to create things new here. Otherwise it would be absolutely nonsensical, everything that I have said today, I think. But yeah, those aspects are not in the core of what I explained here. Very good question, thanks.
Okay, well, thank you so much for your inspiring lecture. Should I go? Okay. So now I'm more visible. Ask a question directly. Yeah, thank you so much. I have 2 or 3 questions. I really enjoyed the last part about fictionality, which goes beautifully in sort of operational way, which is completely against, I would say, the current theories of fiction, which are pretty ontological, much more operational. So I really appreciate this one. And I would maybe begin with the first question regarding to this very point. Of course, I had to think of Jacques Derrida and his logic of supplement, and supplement which substitutes something and also this additional element, so which is pretty not very sort of new logic. How can something be additional, at the same time to substitute something? And I was wondering whether you could see the link between this pretty amazing theory from 60s already and yours of the fictionality as a lack of truthfulness. I think there is something which you put together. So this will be just the first question, and the second one will be more interesting.
Can we take one question at a time? Because otherwise you will lose me very quickly. So yes, I read quite a lot once upon a time and the stuff you're referring to. I think it's interesting in this context. I have to say that some rather famous mathematician from America wrote something like everything Derrida wrote was already formed by Peirce. Derrida only made it more difficult to understand or something like that. So, but obviously the idea that Peirce sometimes formulates the endless chain of semiosis and so forth, I think that is clearly a background to much deconstruction theory. But what Peirce did was to also introduce the possible existence of finite interpreters. So he had the idea that sometimes you may actually reach a definite point. Now we are there. Now we understand. So now we have the logical skeleton here, so to speak. So that would be a different. When it comes to what you mentioned about fictionality here, I think that when I said that fictionality might, if one wants to stick to the notion at all, it could be defined as a lack of truthfulness. But for me, that's a rather pragmatic idea, not mysterious in any way. It's simply that I think that, I mean, I've read quite a lot about fictionality ideas, and I think that there are many different ideas about what fictionality is, and I have never found really one notion of fictionality that has persuaded me, or that even has constituted some kind of backbone for the field. So it seems to me that the study of fictionality, the group of scholars studying fictionality, have never managed to find this one of the basic understanding of fictionality. And on the other hand, it's so very, very common that scholars of fictionality emphasize that, well, fiction is also about truth. You read again and again and again, so there are so many having this sense about fictionality that it might mean that something is not real at all. So I think that this sense in the backend, so to speak, of the scholars emphasizing, no, it's true also in some way. All right. Points, I would say that this is a mental index. That they think that, no, there must be some other way of understanding this, that there is truth. And I mean, take an area such as literary studies. For me, it's kind of absurd to base the studies of literature on a notion stating that literature is not about the real world or the perceived real world. And that is what the notion of fictionality in some way tries to do, even if we then argue that there is some sort of truth in it. So for me, it would also be a very, a strategic way. It's not a strategy that lies behind the way I think, but it would also be a strategic way for people from the humanities, people who study literature and art and music and so forth, to emphasize that a very important feature of literature and so forth is about representing things that are probably more perceived to be real. So it's about truthfulness. And the lack of truthfulness, the possible lack of truthfulness, that is not what is important. I mean, when we read a classical novel, what is not important is that Emma Bovary as such did not exist. That is important. What is important, that her represented feelings and actions and the human interaction being represented, that they are real in the sense being connected to how people really feel and interact mentally and corporally out in the world. So that is what is important, so let us put that in front instead. I diverged, I guess, from what I said. Yeah.
Actually, my point was also sort of answered to that. What was important for the reader was like something institutional, for something new to happen. So that's why I put it on the table, this analogy between your notion of fictionality. Anyway. And the other thing I wanted to ask you was the sphere or the real. You didn't really talk about it a lot, but I'd be very much interested in is the unknown. And of course, we were short of time to talk more about it. But my only question would be put from the perspective of, let's say, media perspective. What are the tools and the means which allow us to distinguish between what is the unknown and what we think to know, what is the known? From the media perspective, what can we be sure about? The clear distinction between these two realms or spheres, if you.
I'm not sure that there's a difference here between talking about what happens in communication from a media perspective and when we talk about how we perceive more directly, how we get access to the outer world. I mean, in both cases, there are so many uncertainties involved. And if you read neuroscientific research and psychological research and so forth, you become acutely aware of the fact that all our sensory impressions our percepts are very far remote. They are far remote from what can be measured, so to speak. So our perceptions are always already, to quote Derrida, interpretations in the way that, actually again, on the basis of early experiences, so on the basis of what might be described as what we know about the world already. So already unconsciously we use these experiences and understanding in order to make sense. So if we see a figure in the shadow, we think that it might be something that we already have in our head. So, so both in the case of communication and direct perception, we simply come to a level or a limit where we simply cannot reach out further. So in a way, this is a very Kantian way of thinking about our perceptions of the world that we can never really reach as such. So the unknown is simply all that we can never perceive. and that we can never communicate about. And if Peirce is right about the final interpretant, we may come very, very close. But it will be a contradiction in terms to say that we finally step over the limit where we can know about the unknown, of course. So, but again, it's not guesswork, of course. So again, we can take the implication of both direct sensory perception and communication and test it in the world. So if we see this shadow, this figure in the shadow, and we think that it might be a cat, then we can test again and again and go there and look. If we don't find a cat, we will never find a cat when we think that we see this structure there. Then we have tested our sensory impressions and proved them wrong. No, definitely. There may always be mistakes. This is the predicament of trials. So that is why I think it's interesting to take the example of trials and compare it with other kinds of communication, because this is the institution in society which has worked longest and hardest with really trying to establish these real connections, and that's why I think it's important to incorporate such notions as the different kinds of continuity being in effect used in trials for chemical traces and biological traces and mechanical prints and so forth. And those are the things that establish truthfulness. So these ideas that I present here are so far away from the logical philosophers writing about truth being about, if A, then B, and then necessarily C, and so forth, because that is about reproducing things that are already known. What I try to capture is truthfulness, how it has been established, the real connection of them. And the unknown will always remain unknown. That is the very simple definition of this sphere outside the spheres. What we are striving towards, perhaps, but we never reach, I think.
I would suggest that we move to the next part of the discussion. And maybe I have like a few comments. So I made a few comments here during the talk. Thank you so much for presenting us with this Persian framework, which actually for us it is important and inspiring, because we have, unlike in the Saussurian semiotics, you have the mediating function or the mediation within the model of the sign, which is not what Saussure did. And so this is what makes Peirce's semiotics obviously more interesting for any media concerns. And one of the comments that one of the first that I made here is that, if I remember right, Peirce distinguishes between two kinds of objects. One is the immediate object, and the other is the mediated object, the immediate object. And this actually just a very brief question. If I remember right, the immediate object is the one that is immediately in the sign, present in the sign, in the relation between representing and the interpreter and the object, and the object immediately in the sign is the user object, in a simple way. Why the object that is being represented as if is always mediated. So this distinction, I guess it goes quite well with your with your framework of material and mental objects, and those
Yes.
material objects being still actually created in the mind.
Yes, exactly. So, as we know, Percy is very difficult to understand often, and has written a lot of things that are maybe sometimes even contradictory and so forth, and he uses terms in various ways. And often he has brilliant ideas that are not really made clear. So that's why there are so many person interpreters. That was my way to say person interpreters. Yeah, okay, so many person interpreters. And I think that one of the useful things in his basic semiotics is exactly this emphasis on that. Well, in the end of the day, semiosis is something that goes on in the mind. And when I say this, people who know Peirce better than me will say that yes, but Peirce was so critical about the notion of mind, so we shouldn't use this term because mind is such a complex idea in Peirce, but I think about mind in a more commonsensical ways. So the basic notion then that in the end of the day, semiosis goes on in the mind. It is a process of interpretation, so to speak. But he also introduces this idea that the object in the mind may correspond to something that is outside the mind. And of course, that is exactly in line with the intra-communication or the extra-communication domains. And in other articles, I always emphasize is that in communication, the representamen always starts with an external representamen. It's something that we perceive out there in the world. And when we perceive it, and then the representamen, there is an internal aspect of the representamen, so to speak, being created in the mind, corresponding to something else in the mind that may in turn correspond to material aspects out there in the world. So yes, that is important. And Peirce never put it that way, but he indicated, so to speak, these possibilities.
And so with this in mind, the several comments that I sort of made here, or question marks, seem to link to very simply to sort of one idea, and that is the role of material aspects or technical and material aspects of communication, simply, where it obviously seems that I think we mentioned that in your lecture that you take body as a kind of media,
Maybe
or media extension of the mind.
the body may be used as a media product. Sure.
So the question, and this is the sort of link I'm thinking about. So it's a series of questions. Is about this sort of this material aspect. I mean, it's obvious that McLuhan, for instance, thought about media as extensions of the body. So the other way around. So that brings in obviously to the technical aspects and to the sort of development of media as something that that has its own sort of logic and that follows its own logic and sort of that interacts also together and so on. But there's this like important technical aspect that without which this development would not be possible. So that's one question, whether this is in any way compatible with the technical or material accounts of mediality that are establishing or that have established media studies and media theory in the 60s and later. or whether this is something that you deliberately want to translate into a different framework. And a related one is the notion of gesture that is somewhere in the sort of structuralist and semiotic framework. There is this notion of gesture in Indexicality and Jankovic as well. And the idea there is that there is a kind of materiality of the gesture of Nukarovsky is talking about literature, but actually that follows the text. It's interesting that he also speaks about photography and about different kinds of media, about incorporating visual media, for instance, in the literary text and poem, and so on, so that there are these media traces or intermediate traces in literature in his account in the 40s. But there is this idea that the gesture is also something that is mute, or whether there is this dimension of the gesture which is purely bodily or motoric, which has a kind of disturbing effect on both, I guess, on any kind of coherence or any kind of external truthfulness, I guess, even though this is not something we just talked about, and so on. And where Jankovic speaks about this gesture as something where the senses or language is as if created anew, and where we experience the shape, which is not obviously only semantic or thematic, but also in terms of rhythm, in terms of sound, and in terms of other different modalities, you could say. And there's this notion of gesture. So if this is something that is in any way compatible with this unknown, I guess.
Yeah, well, I think that there are so many things that are compatible with each other, and many of the ideas that you mentioned are certainly compatible in a general sense with the ideas that I try to promote. What might not be compatible is perhaps how the terms are used and defined, because there are many terms that have been explored in various ways, especially terms related to the notion of communication with the body, such as voice and gesture and so forth, and the concepts are being extended in interesting way and in ways that may open your eyes to certain connections and so forth. But I'm a much more boring kind of researcher, because I try to keep things clear, so to speak. So when I write about gesture, I try to delimit it to one kind of communicative act and so forth. And for me, what is important when it comes to the body is the fact, I think, that it very often works as a media product. So you mentioned McLuhan, media is the extension of man, and as you know, McLuhan is rather broad and open, so to speak, and for me, quite difficult to understand because of its reluctance to define things and so forth. But for me, at least, it's very important to emphasize that to construe the notion of human communication in a way that is really useful for comparing various sorts of media, then I think that you go in the wrong direction if you talk about one body person being a sender and another body person being the receiver, and the medium being something external to the body in the middle. Because if you think of it like that it's got to be a piece of paper or television or something that is external to the body, that is the mediating entity between minds, then you cannot put it on the same level, so to speak, as those kinds of communication that include the body as media products, because the intermediate entities, when we communicate now, for instance, is exactly our bodies and the direct extensions of our bodies. And it's awkward to say that we have the body as a sender and the body as a perceiver, and then we have the bodies being between the bodies as well. That's a bit crazy, I think. So that is why I think that it's better to think about the producer's mind, the perceiver's mind, and the body being one possible asset, one possible conglomeration of materialities that can be used for communication. So in that sense, I want to put the body on the same, within the same conceptual frame, so to speak, as the piece of paper and the screen on the wall and so on.
Which goes well with the idea of gesture, actually. But it seems that the perspectives of those that explore this kind of connection of the body and technology, I think with Lars Elleström and his body-anthropological approach to gesture and speech, and how gesture and speech develop, is that the ascent there is that it enables us to sort of follow how the body is transformed through the technical means, which is not actually against what you're saying. It's just that there is this techno-anthropological complex where bodies are included, and where actually bodies exude tools and exude media, which is Lars Elleström's expression, and change, interactiveness, so that it's also the body that changes, even though very, very slowly. There is a transformation on that medium as well.
Yeah. So those are relevant perspectives. I'm sure that my others will be compatible with those more intricate efforts to define the basic concepts and so forth, avoiding then certain kinds of problems and so forth. But yeah, sure.
The concepts is a very different, or a question or a suggestion it goes in a very different direction. It won't be very long. A couple of times during the presentation, I just felt there is an intersection with one philosopher. It also is, I think, interesting in the context of media theory and also Goodman. But I don't know if, of course, it's one of those, who can be on the list, perhaps. But he has one. He has a specifically speaking about the opposition. It's very opposition, but the two terms of coherence and truthfulness. He has the term rightness because he wants to somehow criticize the notion of truth. So he has the concept of rightness, which is also very, very I would say contextually based and pragmatically based, where I also see the connection with your definition, because it is as I understand it, the differences are very situational. They are based on our ways of behaving, etc. You can't define them in a logical or very abstract way. So that he has this kind of this term of rightness, which might seem to be very strict, but which is not very strict. It's a kind of situational appropriateness. So that's just a kind of suggestion. And also, I would like to ask you if you are somehow dealing with Nelson Goodman's languages of art, and his process, in a way it might be the prehistory of media studies, but on the other hand, he has is very semiotic, is very based in semiotics. It's a semiotic approach, and I didn't encounter that very often in like reading those texts from different perspectives of media studies. So I just wanted to ask you if he's somehow pertinent, or is it a prehistory for you, or what's that?
I think I'm probably not doing Nelson Goodman justice, because on a more personal note, I've developed a slight attitude towards Nelson Goodman, and that is not because I've written all these important books and so forth, but it's because I've written not so little by him, but in the context of iconicity. So for many years I have studied and written about iconicity, and Nelson Goodman is one of those who criticizes the notion of iconicity in a way that I find extremely unfruitful. And well, I think he's wrong from the beginning to the end.
It's the notion of continuity and
it's the notion of similarity. Yeah. So arguing, well, Goodman. I think perhaps Goodman and Umberto Eco are two of the most famous critics of the notion of iconicity, right? And somehow I feel convinced that they got hold of the wrong end of the sticks, so to speak, because they, and don't quote me on this and turn off the camera and so on, because I might remember this in a way that is not absolutely accurate. So, well, with this reservation, I think I remember that one of the problems is that they kind of conflate the notion of similarity and iconicity, right? So now and then arguing something like, well, anything can be similar to anything. So then iconicity would be everywhere, haphazardly, and then we have no use of the notion of iconicity.
Everything is similar to everything.
Yeah,
No,
so,
it can be.
yeah. But then that is pointless. Because when it comes to this, I think that Perse is the one to listen to here. So there's a huge difference between similarity and iconicity, and the difference is that similarity is the possible ground for iconicity. As perceived contiguity or reconnection is the possible ground for indices. So it's not the case that every time we perceive similarity, that triggers the iconic sign function. No. But the perception of similarity, physical or mental similarities, may trigger signification. Right? So it may be that something that is similar to something else achieves the function of commonly represented for that. But I mean, I can perceive the similarities between these classes, and no specific semiosis is triggered, so I perceive the similarity, and that is it. But in another context, I may, if I perceive two classes like this, I see they are similar, and then it might be the case that they trigger a sign function such as two different classes, perhaps there are more classes here, and so forth. So in that way, it's always possible. Again, semiosis, the quality of being a representamen is nothing, it's not something in itself, it's a function. And so there is where I think Eco and Goodman criticize the notion iconicity on a false ground, actually. So that's why I stopped reading Nelson Goodman. I'm sorry.
Actually, I noted down the difference or the disagreement with his disagreement with
continuity as similarities in so there was kind of something under the question, like the direction that you took it.
Yes.
What I was doing.
Yeah. So yeah, I'm sure it's got good ideas about the rightfulness and so forth. And of course, the truth is, if I may saw that there's so many brilliant people who have wrestled with these ideas about what is truth and so forth. So in a way, I really hesitate to. So it's difficult to enter into that discussion. So what I try to do is to elaborate the notion that is workable within this context of mediation, media interrelation, and basic semantic. But 99% of what I say is probably repetitions of others. I don't know. But this is one way of thinking about things in this context.
So I think we have time left for the last question or last comment.
Just a brief comment, actually in another direction than the ones that I mentioned here. I'm not sure whether this one is going to be about media relevance, but you putting emphasis on the establishing of truthfulness, and that's the act that is important. That's someone has to do it, and this brings me to completely another branch of philosophy, which is analytical philosophy, and the act of interpretation. I mean, more precisely, the acts of interpretation that really establish truth or truthfulness, or you can say validity, or you can say contextual validity, relevance. Actually, you can float around, float between the terms and pick which one you choose, but the act is important. And I'm thinking of Paul Ricoeur or Hans-Georg Adame and the followers, who talk also about communication. It's surprising for me because at the first glance it looks more like analytical style of thinking, but it brings me personally, because I'm really studied hermeneutics a lot, brings me to this tradition. And the point is that the question would be, would you then take on board all the hermeneutical equipment, like the person of the interpreting person, his situation, his personal situation, his context, his life, history, and all that? Or would you just cut it off at some point?
No, I will take it on board. If not everything, so most of it. And sure. So before I really dived into semiotics and the Persian philosophy and so forth, I knew much more about hermeneutics and that kind of tradition. So for me, those are, I don't emphasize that much, perhaps because I take them for granted in a way, because it's clear that those things are important. And the connection, working with Persian philosophy, is, I think, well, among other things, his notion of collateral experience. What we have already experienced and what we already know. So in a way, that notion, that idea, opens up towards all of these things. Because collateral experience may be shared, it may be more individual, it may be specific, it may be very general, and so forth. So the collateral experience, what is in the background, what we have already experienced in the extra communicational domain, so to speak, that consists more or less of all those things that hermeneutic is trying to describe and has succeeded in describing in very successful ways, I think so. Yeah, so I'm glad that you're looking through this, that I'm not a formalist, so to speak, of the
where does it come into? That's a problem with the hermeneutic philosophy. It doesn't really reflect on that too much.
But I think that the humanistic branch of hermeneutics, I think it fits rather well also with the areas of psychology and neuroscience and so forth, that deal with understanding and interpretation on another level, but nevertheless emphasizing very much that there are so much in the background, so many factors that are present that we cannot do much about, so to speak, that form our understandings from the outset. So both when it comes to basic perception, how the neurons work in our heads and so forth, and then to more conscious cultural experiences that we can formulate and that are more, that can be more actively discussed and molded in our minds, so to speak. So, yeah.
Thank you so much. And thank you for staying.
Thank you.